every breath. And in Jesus' case, this went on for 6 hours. To give you some idea of the intensity of what was going on there. Now, what this produces medically is, as this goes on and on and on, you physically become no longer strong enough to be able to pull yourself up. So the motion becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, and you get to the point where you can't breathe. And as you can't breathe, there's longer intervals of time between the time you do take breaths. And so carbon dioxide begins to build up in the blood, and the carbon dioxide causes the blood to become more acidic. This causes muscle cramps, severe contractions of the muscles, almost like seizures, tetanic contractions. And over time, you begin to develop what's called exhaustion asphyxia. Asphyxia is a medical term when you can't breathe for whatever reason. Someone who dies from hanging, it's because the rope actually blocks off the air. You can't breathe in or out, and you die of what's known as asphyxia. And if you look at a coroner's report, that's what you'll see as the cause of death, asphyxia. In this case, in the case of crucifixion, you get what's known as exhaustion asphyxia. It's so intensely painful and takes so much physical effort for every breath, you eventually get to where you can't breathe, or you breathe less and less and less, and eventually it causes death. Now let's look at the spear wound in the side and the effusions. The effusions actually come from the acidosis, from all this carbon dioxide building up in the blood. It causes fluid to start to collect in two places. Between the lung and the chest wall is called the pleural space, and you get what's known as a pleural effusion, which simply means that you get liquid or clear water-like fluid collecting there between the lung and the chest wall. It causes the lungs to begin to collapse. And you also get effusions between the heart and the sac that goes around the heart called the pericardium, and those are known as pericardial effusions. That's why when you read in the book of John, when the spear wound was put into Jesus' side, we believe it went in through the right side, through the pleural space, through the pericardial space, and into the right ventricle. And John records that Jesus, when he was the spear wound in the side, that there was both blood and water that came forth. And that's what the water was effusions that had collected in those two spaces, as well as blood directly from the heart, the right ventricle. Now, what's the cause of death? This is what you would actually put on a death certificate of someone who had been crucified. First is cardiac arrest. It means the heart basically stops beating. This is most likely due to a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. And that's most commonly what we call ventricular fibrillation. When the heart contracts, it's like a muscle. It's about the size of your fist. And when it pumps blood, with each heartbeat, you get contraction of that muscle, and it squeezes the blood out of the heart, out through the vascular system. When someone has ventricular fibrillation, instead of having these rhythmic contractions, basically the muscle just quivers. It's completely ineffective. It can't pump. It can't move any blood. And if that is not corrected within a matter of a couple minutes, the person will die. And that's what we believe is likely what happened to Jesus on the cross. And it was because of all this severe buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood, and the blood pH would begin to go down and down and down, and eventually it gets to a level where it won't sustain life. The ventricular fibrillation happens, the heart is no longer able to beat, and that's what causes the death. So the cardiac arrhythmia was due to the respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis is due to the exhaustion asphyxia, which means it takes so much physical effort to take each breath, and the pain is so intense that eventually the person wears out and they can't breathe anymore, and that's what causes the death. And then in Jesus' case, it was also complicated by hypovolemic shock. And he was undoubtedly in very severe physical condition before the crucifixion even took place, just from the intensity of the flogging. So let's summarize. The pain in the garden was almost all emotional. But I can't imagine what it's like for the Son of God to be praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing full well that he was going to be falsely accused, that he was going to be intensely flogged, that he was going to be condemned to die and crucified in the next few hours. And at the same time, bearing the weight of the sin of the entire human race for all time and eternity on his shoulders. That's the most intense emotional pain that I can imagine. There was the pain of the trials in which Jesus was standing there before the authorities, the Jewish leaders, men that should be able to be respected, and given these sham trials and false evidence accusing him of things that he obviously didn't do. And even Pilate, you can read it in Scripture over and over again. He says, I find no fault in this man. There's no crime committed here, and he should be set free. Then the intense pain of the scourging that we have described, how the entire back was raw from all this flogging and the intense amount of blood loss. Then the pain of trying to carry the cross and the fact that Jesus, despite being in excellent physical condition, was not able to carry that patibulum, and instead he fell enough times that finally, as Josh told you earlier, the Romans just grabbed somebody and made them carry it for him. Then the pain of the crucifixion. 6 hours of hanging on the cross, struggling for every breath. Every time you breathe, you have to pull up with both arms and push up with both feet, and the intense amount of pain and suffering that causes. And then in the very end, excruciating death. I'm going to end with that. I don't really talk about the resurrection in this presentation because it's not something that science really can analyze. It's something that we know happened, and it's something that's supernatural. So I'm going to stop with that. And Pastor, if you want me to answer some questions, I'll be happy to do that. I know the hour's a little late.
I think it'd be interesting if some of you do have a question that we pass it on to them while we're all here, because it may be a question that someone else has.
Or if you don't want to ask public questions, feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards. I'll be happy to answer questions you might have. Does anybody have a burning question you want to ask?